It is time to return to the wonderful, miserable world of Necropolis, the small-scale skirmish game I started building my board for almost exactly a year ago. Now I already have fitting miniatures and, of course, the aforementioned gaming board. However, what I still need are some very specific tokens. Necropolis features a fascinating mechanic where fallen minions serve as a magic source. Depending on the type of minion, this magic manifests as bone, plasm, or blood mana. With these three distinct types, it's a perfect opportunity to showcase three different approaches to creating tokens, each varying in time investment and the tools involved. Each token in this approach has a diameter of 25mm, essentially the classic 25mm miniature base. Since I have a bunch of inexpensive plastic bases lying around, this is the most practical choice for me. However, you can use any similarly sized material if you prefer. I would advise against going larger though. Since I mostly have slaughter bases, I started by covering the slot with a thin sheet of polystyrene. If you don't have that available, you can easily substitute it with a piece of packaging plastic or even just a piece of paper. So first let's start with the bone token. For that I simply used various bits I had on hand and added bone-like pieces such as rib cages, skulls and bone appendages to the bases. You can even throw in a few rotten weapons if you like. I made sure to keep a balanced amount of each piece on the base, so you won't find multiple rib cages or 4 legs on my tokens. But that doesn't mean you can get creative and go wild with it. Once I was happy with the amount of bits, I added some texture paste to the empty areas of the base. This can get a bit messy, and sometimes the paste lands where it shouldn't, but that's perfectly fine for old dusty bones, at least in my opinion. In the end, I painted the tokens using my airbrush. I started by priming them with Molotov's hazelnut brown, then added light ochre brown from a 90 degrees angle from the top. After that I dry brushed the tokens with an off-white. I then painted the rest of the pieces with fitting speed paints, like palette bones for the bones and dark wood for the occasional wooden parts. To finish, I applied pigment powders to give the tokens an overall dusty look. For the next token, the Plasm token, I introduced green stuff and milliput as I envisioned something like a magical flame forming into a spherical shape and hovering over the ground. To begin, I used the same 25mm base as before and added short round pieces of a miniature sprue. On top of that, I placed a small sphere of green stuff. This simple structure already provides a rough framework for the sculpting step that follows. As mentioned, I used milliput and green stuff for this project. By combining both putties, I achieved a blend that sits somewhere in between. Not as sticky as pure green stuff and not as brittle as milliput. This also helps bring down costs as milliput is significantly cheaper than green stuff. To prevent fingerprints on the epoxy, I used nitro gloves. Admittedly, crafting with gloves isn't as comfortable as working with bare hands, but it makes achieving a smooth finish on the final product much easier. I started by applying the putty to form the rough shape of the design I had in mind. Once the basic shape was in place, I sculpted a few wavy lines and details to give it a fiery, organic look. After everything had sufficiently hardened, I added even more details by attaching a few putty tendrils to the spherical shape, enhancing the overall effect. For painting, I kept it very simple, arguably even simpler than with the previous token. I aimed for a metallic look combined with color-shifting paints. After priming the tokens, I applied a very glossy black as the first base coat to maximize the effect of these paints. I could have used a glossy black primer directly, but since I didn't have any on hand, I added this extra step instead. Once the base coat was ready, I used my airbrush to apply the color shifting paint. This resulted in a very unnatural and magical look, which was exactly what I was going for. With the bone and plasm tokens complete, we're only missing the blood mana tokens. For these I wanted to create a gruesome pool of blood, innards and twisted corpse pieces. An excellent opportunity to experiment with clear resin. I must admit my experience with the resin is limited, but it's not as complicated as it might seem. Before pouring the resin I needed something to contain it. In other words, I needed a mold in the form of a 25mm base, ideally 5 of them. So let's make one. For this I decided to use silicone, so I started by taking a few bases and sealing the undersides with thinner bases of the same diameter. These came from frostgrave plastic kits, which include flat style bases instead of the more traditional GW style ones. Since I don't have much use for them otherwise, they were perfect for this purpose. Next I glued the bases top first onto a piece of leftover MDF. You could also use foam core or any other flat even surface for this kind of task. To contain the silicone, I framed the entire construction with foam core pieces, making sure there were no gaps. Leaking silicone is definitely not what we're aiming for here. While I'm not usually a huge advocate for hot glue, it's absolute ideal for this sort of job. It's cheap, fast, and it doesn't matter if the edges of the glue are messy or visible. When it comes to mixing silicone, it's a good idea to have a scale on hand to help balance the ratio of the components. For silicone, you're aiming for a 1:1 ratio to activate the curing process. After thoroughly mixing the mix with a popsicle stick or any other expandable tool, you can pour it into the previously built form. Now all that's left is to wait roughly 24 hours for the silicone to cure. In the meantime I worked on constructing the rest of the token. Since I wanted all my tokens to be magnetized, I used magnetic foil cutouts that are precisely 25mm in diameter. These are also very thin, making them ideal for use as the underside of the tokens. To add texture, I applied Vallejo texture paste to create a bit of ground clutter, then adorned the pieces with various bits that could be interpreted as shattered corpse fragments. After that I moved on to painting, which I also kept very simple. I primed the token in green and then applied a zenithal highlight with a bright red. I used these two Molotov paints for the process, and if you're interested in picking these up, you'll find a link down below. It's an affiliate link, so any hobby purchases made through it help support the channel a bit. You can also consider joining my Patreon if you're interested in more videos like this. There you'll get early access to videos, as well as short updates on upcoming projects. With the tokens painted and the silicone cured, I mixed the resin. The ratio I used here was 2:1 of resin to hardener, but if you're using a different product, be sure to read the instructions beforehand, as there can be differences between products. After thoroughly mixing the resin, I added 1 drop of transparent brown ink and 2 drops of transparent red ink to create a semi-transparent blood effect. While blood is typically opaque, this coloration gives me a bit of realism while still maintaining some transparency. And after about 24 hours, again, check the instructions, the resin should be fully hardened and the pieces can be safely removed from the mold. And here are the 3 different tokens for every mana type in Necropolis. I hope you enjoyed this video and the build. I believe there is something for every skill level, and you can easily adapt one or another technique for your own project. Please consider leaving a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in fantasy-oriented crafting content for your tabletop games. I hope to see you in the next one, and until then, farewell, fellow adventurers.